Hello, friends. We are back in Egypt, where many secrets and mysteries have not yet been revealed. Today, I want to tell you about mummies. What is a mummy and for whom was it created? The history of artificial preservation of the bodies of the dead goes back to ancient times. The process of mummification was common in many cultures around the world. But in ancient Egypt, this process had an important religious significance. Mummification in ancient Egypt, or the art of embalming, consisted of preserving bodies from decomposition and putrefaction by soaking them in antiseptic substances known since ancient times. Since the annual floods of the Nile kept the surface of the earth underwater for 2 months, the Egyptians came up with better methods to prevent the decomposition of the bodies of the dead. In ancient Egypt, all human bodies and even many animals were embalmed. The Egyptian method was described by Diodorus, but there were many other methods of embalming. People who did embalming, or doctors, were considered sacred and lived in necropolises. The Egyptians developed sophisticated methods of preserving bodies that were so effective that their mummies survived for thousands of years. Why was the mummification technique necessary for the ancient Egyptians, and who could dream of becoming a mummy after death? Egypt was home to the most prominent and colossal cult of the dead on earth. The ancient Egyptians believed in life after death. The inhabitants of the land of the pharaohs thought that only the body dies, but the soul of a person remains alive. They claimed and believed that after death, the soul leaves the deceased in peace for a while and then returns to the remains. Therefore, for a successful reunification, the body had to remain intact. This reunion would mark the beginning of the path to life after death, so that a person could live forever, and the soul would recognize its body when it returned to it. The ancient Egyptians developed unique methods of creating mummies that preserved the bodies of the dead virtually unchanged. This invention was so significant that it was reflected in the mythological heritage of the powerful Egyptian civilization. According to the myth, the god Osiris was killed by his jealous brother Seth, and his body parts were scattered throughout Egypt. But the god Anubis, with the help of Isis, found them, collected them, treated them with oils, wrapped them in a long cloth, and breathed life into the dead body. This is how the first mummy appeared in ancient Egypt. Embalming, dressing, and wrapping the dead were under the protection of Anubis, who guarded the tombs and protected the mummies, accompanied the souls of the dead to the underworld of Amenti, and interceded for a merciful judgment for them in the afterlife. This god was depicted as a jackal or a man with a jackal's head. The ancient Greeks and Romans, mistaking the jackal for a dog, called Anubis a god with the head of a dog or wolf. The word mummy comes from a Persian term that translates as wax. Medieval Arab and Jewish doctors used the word mummy to refer to a special medicine. Indeed, in the Middle Ages, Arab and Jewish traders acquired wax from Egyptian tombs of ancient mummies. They broke them into small pieces, ground them into powder, and sold them as medicine. Until recently, this medicine could be found in almost every pharmacy in Europe. Shilajit was believed to help heal bruises and wounds. The ancient Egyptians originally buried their dead in the dry desert, allowing the hot, dry sand to dehydrate the bodies, causing natural mummification. Mummification became part of Egyptian culture. Only those of high social status and wealth were allowed to mummify their bodies, and only the wealthy classes could do so. In Egypt at that time, this category included the pharaohs, their relatives and confidants, guards and advisors, and priests. As for ordinary people, it was long believed that they had no soul in principle, so they did not need this procedure. However, over time, ordinary people could also turn their deceased loved ones into mummies if they had the means to do so. There is a fragment of papyrus dating back 3,500 years, the contents of which are a medical treatise, mainly devoted to skin diseases and herbal treatment. But it also contains very interesting data on mummification. After death, the body of the deceased was transferred to a special room where the entire ritual was performed, lasting from 30 to 70 days. Apparently, before the pharaoh's body was ready to pass into the underworld, it was necessary to remove all organs except the heart. In some cases, the kidneys were also left. The organs were stored separately in ceremonial vessels. The pharaoh's brain was also removed, but in a slightly different way than the other organs. A hole was made in the base of the skull. The brain was removed in small portions and thrown away. The first step, not counting the preparation of embalming, was drying the body. For this purpose, naturally occurring soda was used, collected in places where dry lakes once existed. This mixture consisted mainly of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate. In small quantities, it can also contain sodium chloride and sodium sulfate. In addition to absorbing water, carbonated water removes fat from the body. The action of the soda prevented decomposition of the body for 40 days. During this time, ancient specialists had to complete the entire embalming ritual. After complete drying, the soda was scraped off the body. The next step was to fill the body with wood shavings and flax using a variety of additives: cinnamon, myrtle, frankincense, cassia. According to some sources, even onions. The dried body still did not smell very pleasant. Therefore, all these manipulations and ingredients were supposed to eliminate unpleasant odors. Some substances served other non-aromatic purposes. It is not known whether the Egyptians themselves were aware of all the properties of these fillers. Some of them certainly had antimicrobial properties. For example, cinnamon contains cinnamaldehyde, which acts as an antiseptic. Other ingredients, such as onions, did not add pleasant odors, but also contained components that prevent the development of microorganisms. In one case, onions were used in the eye sockets and ear canals of the mummy of Ramses IV. Some scientists have suggested that the bulb on the eyes was placed for realism. Why the bulb was needed in the mummy's ears remains a mystery. After carefully preparing the body, it was time to wrap it in linen bandages. Often before the procedure, the body was anointed with a small amount of oil, and the bandages were soaked in resin. Throughout the practice of mummification, the Egyptians used various types of oils and resins, but most often it was the resin of coniferous trees, cedar. Some of the known mummies were wrapped in bandages soaked in beeswax. Chromatography mass spectrometry analysis allowed scientists to more accurately determine the types of resins used in ancient times for mummification. For example, the presence of traces of abiotic acid indicates the use of resins of coniferous trees, guaiacol, cedar oil, esterane, and hopanoids. The main sources of optical activity of oil, bitumen. Bandages soaked in resin dried and isolated the body from water, oxygen, and microbes, preventing further decomposition. By the way, guaiacol also has an additional bactericidal effect. Beeswax was used to seal all the holes. Of all the substances used in embalming, natural bitumen is probably the best known. Probably this is the reason for the blackening of some mummies. But of course not all, since it began to be actively used in mummification only in the last stages of the existence of ancient Egypt. The first mummies were made without it. The embalmed body was usually placed in a sarcophagus in the shape of a human figure, made of sycamore wood, or in other words, fig wood, or of stone. The sarcophagus often depicted the face of the deceased. It was placed upright against the wall of the house and remained there for many years. The mummies were then taken to underground caves or rock grottos, where they were often found after 2,000 to 3,000 years in a state of complete preservation. The embalmed body was usually placed in a sarcophagus in the shape of a human figure, made of sycamore wood, or in other words, fig wood, or of stone. The sarcophagus often depicted the face of the deceased. It was placed upright against the wall of the house and remained there for many years. The mummies were then taken to underground caves or rock grottos, where they were often found after 2,000 to 3,000 years in a state of complete preservation. These are, in general, the main chemical secrets of mummification. Is a mummy needed today, in the age of technology and robots? What do you think? Write your opinion in the comments.